The snow had been falling for 2 hours by the time Hannah Caldwell straightened her coat, pushed open the glass door of Sinclair's Steakhouse, and reminded herself for the third time since leaving her apartment that she was doing this for her mother. The hostess smiled and pointed her toward a corner table, where a man in a crisp charcoal suit sat with his arms crossed, checking his phone with the studied impatience of someone who had never been made to wait in his life. His name, according to the contact her mother had forwarded, was Preston Beaumont. 41 years old, financial analyst. Single, no children, successful, according to the email, a word her mother had underlined twice. Hannah sat down. Preston looked up. His expression didn't change. Not a smile, not a nod, just a brief, clinical scan that moved from her face to her coat to her shoes, and then back to the middle distance, somewhere past her shoulder. He said, "You're late." 4 minutes, Hannah said. "It's snowing." He picked up the menu. She should have known, in that moment, how the evening would end. But she sat down anyway, folded her napkin across her lap, and decided to give it 30 minutes. 22 minutes later, Preston Beaumont stood up from the table slowly, deliberately, in front of every person in that dining room and said the sentence that would change her life. "You're not the kind of woman a successful man marries." The restaurant went silent. And then, a man at the table beside hers, a man she hadn't noticed at all, a man in a simple gray sweater with paint on his left cuff, stood up too. He had 2 children with him, twins, maybe 6 years old, wide-eyed and clutching the edges of the booth. He looked at Hannah with an expression she couldn't quite read, not pity, not anger, something quieter than either of those. He said, "I'm sorry." It had started, as most of Hannah's bad evenings did, with a favor. She was 29 years old, a 4th-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary in the kind of mid-sized Ohio city where everyone knew everyone's cousin. And her mother, a warm, relentless woman named Diane, had been trying to fix her up with someone for the better part of 3 years. Hannah didn't object to the idea of meeting someone. She objected to the theater of it. The profile photos and the rehearsed questions and the general sense of being evaluated, like a house listed in a buyer's market. But Diane had called on a Tuesday evening while Hannah was grading math worksheets and had deployed, in order, guilt, "I only want you to be happy," statistics, "You're 29, not 19, and finally the specific grief of a woman who had been widowed 4 years earlier and now had nobody to worry about except her daughter. Hannah had said yes. She'd spent longer than she would admit getting ready, not because she was trying to impress Preston Beaumont, but because she was, at her core, a person who believed in showing up well. She'd worn her nicest navy dress and the small pearl earrings her father had given her the year he died, and she'd taken a cab so the snow wouldn't ruin her shoes. None of it had mattered, she understood now. Watching Preston settle back into his seat and signal to a passing waiter with the 2-fingered gesture of someone who has never had to ask twice. He had begun the evening with questions about her work, not with genuine curiosity, but with the tone of a man mentally tallying figures. Teacher, public school, salary in the mid-40s. His expression had registered something between tolerance and disappointment. "Do you own or rent?" he'd asked. "Somewhere between the bread service and the water refill." "Rent." "And your parents, what did your father do?" She'd told him. Construction supervisor, retired early due to injury, passed away 4 years ago. She'd kept her voice neutral, factual, the way she'd learned to discuss it. Preston had nodded the nod of a man updating a spreadsheet. He'd asked about her car. She took the bus. He'd asked about her credit. She hadn't answered. He'd asked whether she had any investment accounts, any real estate prospects, any family money, the phrase family money delivered with a studied casualness, as though he were asking about the weather. "Preston," she'd said quietly, "I'm a teacher. I make enough to live comfortably and enough to save a little. If that's not what you were hoping for, we can end the evening here and that's fine." He hadn't liked that. She'd watched his jaw tighten, watched him reassemble his composure. "I'm just trying to get a realistic picture," he said. "Of what?" of compatibility. She'd looked at him, then really looked and understood with the clear, tired certainty of someone who has spent too long making things work that this was not going to work, had never been going to work, and that the kindest thing would be to pay her half of the check and leave. She'd been reaching for her purse when Preston stood up. He hadn't done it quietly. He'd pushed his chair back with the kind of force that drew attention, stood to his full height, and delivered his verdict to the room at large. You're not the kind of woman a successful man marries. You don't have the right ambitions. You don't have the right background. I'm not trying to be cruel, I'm being honest. Some men are looking for comfort and warmth. I'm looking for a partner who can match what I've built. He straightened his jacket. Good night. He left. The restaurant was silent for 3 full seconds. That particular silence that a room makes when it has collectively witnessed something it isn't sure how to process. Then a low murmur resumed, careful and pointed. Hannah sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking at the space where Preston had been sitting, at the untouched glass of water and the folded napkin in the breadbasket he hadn't touched. She was not going to cry. She had decided this before the words had even fully landed. She was not going to cry. She was going to stand up, put on her coat, walk out into the snow, and call her mother and say, "I tried. I gave it 22 minutes. That's more than it deserved." She reached for her coat, and then, from the table beside her, someone stood up. His name, she would learn later, was Elliot Hartley. He was 36 years old, and he had been sitting at the booth beside her for the better part of an hour, with his 2 children, twins, named Nora and Owen, 6 years old, who had spent most of that time coloring on paper placemats with the restaurant's crayons, while their father watched them with the particular, exhausted tenderness of a man who had been doing this alone for a long time. Hannah had barely registered him when she'd sat down. She'd noticed the children vaguely, their dark heads bent together over the placemats, their small voices negotiating about which crayon was whose, and had thought, privately, that whoever was taking care of them was doing a decent job of keeping them occupied. She had not, in any dimension of her imagination, anticipated what happened next. Elliot Hartley stood up, moved 2 steps to stand beside her table, and held out his hand. He said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I know I'm a stranger. I know this is an insane thing to say." He stopped, ran one hand through his hair dark, a little too long, the kind of hair that suggested he kept meaning to get it cut and kept forgetting. "That man was wrong," Elliot said. "I just want you to know that. What he said, it was wrong." "Thank you," Hannah said carefully. He hesitated, and then she would replay this moment for weeks afterward, turning it over like a strange coin. He said, "I know this is going to sound insane. I want to say up front that I am a normal person. I am not dangerous, and I understand completely if you say no. But would you consider marrying me?" The table beside them had gone very quiet. 2 of the nearest tables had also gone quiet. A waiter had stopped walking. Hannah looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, without flinching, his expression serious and a little desperate and, she thought, genuinely embarrassed. "I don't know you," she said. "I know. You're asking me to marry you?" "I am. I know how it sounds." From the booth behind him, a small voice said, "Dad, is she going to be our mom?" Hannah looked past Elliot to the 2 children, who were both watching her with the enormous, unguarded eyes of children who have learned not to hope too hard for things but haven't quite learned to stop hoping. Something shifted in her chest. She said, "Sit down. Both of you, your children too. Sit down and tell me what's going on." His wife's name had been Caroline. She had died 2 years earlier, a car accident on a February morning. Ordinary road, ordinary ice. The kind of thing that has no meaning and no lesson and leaves only an absence that reshapes everything around it. Elliot told it plainly, without embellishment, the way a man tells a story he has told many times to many people and has stripped of all unnecessary weight. The twins, Nora and Owen, had been 4 years old, too young to understand, too young to not notice. They had spent 6 months asking when Mommy was coming home, and then had stopped asking, which was somehow worse. "I'm not a sad person," Elliot said, as though anticipating a particular kind of pity. "I've been doing okay. We've been doing okay. My sister helps on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My neighbor watches them when I have late nights. We have a routine." "But," Hannah said. He was quiet for a moment. Nora had climbed off the bench and was now leaning against his arm, her crayon still in her hand. Owen was watching Hannah with a careful, measuring look that she recognized. It was the look of a child who has learned that adults sometimes disappear. "Nora had a school project last month," Elliot said. "A drawing. My family." She drew me and Owen, and then a blank space where she put a question mark. He paused. "She was 6, he said. "She already knows something is missing, and I've been trying to figure out how to fix it, and I haven't. I've been on 3 dates in 2 years, and they were all terrible, and I keep thinking I'm doing it wrong, that I'm going about it the wrong way, looking for the right feeling before I have enough information to know if the feeling is even possible." He looked at her directly then, "And then I watched what just happened to you, and I thought, here is someone kind enough to sit through something humiliating and not make a scene. Here is someone who didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't say anything cruel back, just sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight. And I thought, that's exactly the kind of person I want my children to grow up around." Hannah was quiet for a long time. "What are you actually proposing?" she asked finally. "Walk me through what you actually mean. A trial. You move in, we have a spare room. We spend time together, all 4 of us, and see if there's enough there to build on. If there isn't, if it's miserable or wrong, or it doesn't work, we stop. No harm, no legal entanglement. But if it does work, I'm not looking for perfection," he said. "I'm not looking for someone who's going to transform my life into something from a magazine. I just want someone good, someone who'll be present, someone who'll help me give these 2 a home that feels whole." Nora tugged at Hannah's sleeve. "Can you make pancakes?" she asked, in the serious tone of someone for whom this is a non-negotiable criterion. Owen said, "She probably can. She looks like she can." Hannah laughed, a real one, unexpected, that surprised her more than anything else that had happened that evening. "I can make pancakes," she said. She didn't say yes that night. She went home, sat in her apartment with the snow still falling outside the window, and made herself think through it carefully, not quickly, not in the grip of the warm, strange feeling the evening had left in her chest, but slowly, with the part of her brain that made lesson plans and tracked student progress and stayed calm when 8-year-olds had meltdowns before standardized testing. She was not an impulsive person. She did not make large decisions without considering them from multiple angles. This was, by any reasonable measure, the largest and most impulsive thing anyone had ever asked her to do. She thought about it for 5 days. She told her best friend, Petra, a nurse with a direct manner and a very low tolerance for what she called romantic nonsense, on day 2. Petra was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Hannah, he is a stranger. He could be anyone. He could have a criminal record. He could be completely unhinged. He had 2 children coloring on placemats," Hannah said. "Unhinged people have children, Hannah," she told her mother on day 3. Diane was silent for an even longer time, long enough that Hannah checked whether the call had dropped. "A widower," Diane said finally. "With twins?" "Yes. And he asked you at the restaurant out of nowhere?" "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Well, he certainly didn't waste time." "Mom, is that all you're going to say?" "I'm thinking." A pause. "Was he kind? When he talked about his children, was he kind?" Hannah thought about Nora leaning against Elliot's arm with the crayon still in her hand, Owen's careful, measuring look, the blank space with the question mark in Nora's drawing. "Yes," she said. "He was kind." Diane said, "Then you should think about it seriously." On day 5, she called Elliot. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear the twins in the background, a small argument about something, quickly mediated by a patient, tired voice before he came back to the phone. She said yes, Hannah told him. Provisionally. I want clear conditions and I want the right to leave without complications if it isn't working. Of course, he said. Yes, all of that. She thought she could hear the particular quality of a long breath released. And I need to meet the twins properly first, she added. Not at a restaurant. Somewhere they're comfortable. I need to spend time with them before anything else. Of course, he said again. A pause. They asked about you, by the way. Both of them. Owen wants to know if you play chess. Nora wants to know if you have a dog. I don't have a dog. She'll probably ask if you'd be willing to get one. Hannah looked at her small apartment, at her neat bookshelf and her graded papers and her quiet, organized life. Tell her it's under consideration, she said. She had prepared herself to be underwhelmed. The address Elliot had given her led into a residential neighborhood she didn't know, well tree-lined, quiet, the kind of street where old houses had been renovated with care rather than speed. She'd driven past twice before finding the right number, a wide craftsman house set back from the street, with a porch light on and a long driveway where two small bicycles leaned against the garage. She parked, sat for a moment. The house was larger than she'd expected, much larger. There was a fence around a side yard, where she could see the frame of what appeared to be a partially constructed treehouse. The garden was not manicured. It had the comfortable disorder of a space where children had been allowed to be children. But the path to the door was clear, and the porch boards were solid, and the whole thing gave off an air of being, fundamentally, cared for. Elliot opened the door before she could knock. He was wearing a flannel shirt with a small paint smear near the collar, not charcoal this time, but a faint amber, and looked, in the context of his own home, easier. Less like a man making a case, and more like a man standing in the place where he most made sense. Hi, he said. Hi, she said. You have a treehouse. 40% finished. Owen changed the design twice. Do you build things? Sometimes. I find it useful. She stepped inside. The house was warm, and it smelled like something baking cinnamon, she thought, and something underneath it, something toasty, and every surface in the hallway had the layered, cheerful disorder of a house where small people lived. Drawings pinned to a corkboard, a pair of small boots kicked off near the mat, a plastic dinosaur standing on the bottom step of the stairs with the gravity of a sentry. Nora and Owen appeared from the kitchen at a controlled run. The run of children who have been specifically told not to run, but are running as slowly as they can possibly manage. Hi, said Nora immediately. Do you like cinnamon rolls? We made them. She said this with the proprietary pride of someone who had, perhaps, stirred the bowl. I love cinnamon rolls, Hannah said. Owen studied her with the serious expression she recognized. Then he said, I am. 4th grade. Do you give a lot of homework? Hannah considered this seriously. Some, but I try to make it interesting. Owen appeared to weigh this. Okay, he said finally, in the tone of someone granting a provisional pass. Later, she sat at the kitchen table while Elliot made coffee, and Nora explained, at length and in great detail, the taxonomy of cinnamon rolls with icing versus without icing, warm versus room temperature, weekday versus weekend. Owen sat across from Hannah and showed her his chess set, a heavy wooden one that had belonged to his grandfather, and explained the rules with the painstaking thoroughness of someone who had not yet grasped that the person he was teaching might already know them. Hannah let him explain. She asked questions at the right moments. She moved the pieces when he told her to. Elliot, from across the kitchen, watched this and said nothing, and looked away. She noticed she'd been living in the spare room for 3 weeks before she found out. It had not been, in those 3 weeks, the arrangement she'd expected. She'd anticipated awkwardness, the particular uncomfortable friction of 2 strangers attempting proximity, but the house seemed to absorb her with a naturalness that unsettled her more than discomfort would have. She helped with school drop-offs on Tuesdays when Elliot had early calls. She made dinner twice a week, nothing elaborate. The reliable things she knew: pasta, roasted chicken, the soups she made in large batches on Sundays. She helped Nora with a school report on monarch butterflies, and spent a Saturday afternoon watching Owen walk her through every opening sequence he knew in chess. Elliot, for his part, was easy to live with in the way that people who have learned to manage their own company tend to be easy to live with. He cleaned up after himself. He was quiet in the mornings. He remembered, without being told, that she took her coffee with 1 sugar and no milk. She was beginning cautiously, tentatively, with the wariness of someone who has learned not to trust pleasant things too quickly to think that this might be working. And then she went to his office. She'd needed to drop off a folder, Nora's permission slip for a school trip, which she'd found in the kitchen, and which Elliot had apparently forgotten, and since she was driving past the address he'd given her, she'd stopped. The building was 22 stories of glass and dark stone in the middle of downtown. She'd walked into the lobby and given her name to the receptionist and been directed to the 11th floor. The 11th floor was a large, open space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. There were perhaps 40 people visible from where she stood. The reception desk bore the name Hartley Group in clean, substantial letters. A young woman in a headset met her at the elevator. "Miss Caldwell? I'll let Mr. Hartley know you're here." And then a man in a dark suit who was clearly not Elliot emerged from a glass-walled conference room, saw her, and said loudly, to no one in particular, "Has anyone told Mr. Hartley his guest is here? Someone find the CEO." Hannah stood very still. Elliot appeared from a side corridor 2 minutes later, still in conversation with someone, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking entirely at ease in a space that was, she now understood, entirely his. He saw her expression and stopped talking mid-sentence. "Hi," he said carefully. "Hi," she said. "CEO." A pause. "Can we talk?" he said. "We're going to," she said. She had not raised her voice. That was the thing she would remember afterward, that she hadn't shouted, hadn't cried, had spoken to him in the quiet, controlled tone of someone who is angrier than noise. They'd gone to a small conference room at the end of the floor. Elliot had closed the door. She'd set the permission slip on the table between them and looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He'd known the question was coming and had clearly been thinking about how to answer it, because he'd answered it without hesitation. "Because every time I've told someone, the dynamic shifts. The way they look at me, the way they talk to me. I stop being a person and I become a situation to navigate." "That's a real reason," she said. "I understand that. But I am living in your house. I have been making decisions about my life based on what I thought was accurate information about our situation." "I know. I thought you were. I thought you were comfortable. I thought the spare room was your spare room, not one of several spare rooms in what is apparently a very large house owned by—" "It doesn't change anything real," he said. "The arrangement is the same. My children are the same." "You should have told me." "Yes," he said. "I should have told you. You're right." She looked at him. He looked back, not defensively, not with the calculating steadiness of someone managing a situation, but with the flat openness of someone who knows they've made an error and is not going to argue about it. She picked up the permission slip. "Nora's field trip is Friday," she said. "She needs this signed by Wednesday." She slid it across the table and stood up. "I'm going home," she said. She stopped. "To your house. I mean, I'm going back to your house, and I'm going to think about this." "Okay," he said. She left. For 2 days after that, she was quieter than usual. She was present, she made dinner, she helped with homework. She listened to Nora's extended monologue about what she planned to see on the field trip, but she was also somewhere else, in a room inside herself, where she was turning things over. She thought about whether she was angry because she'd been deceived, or angry because the deception made her question everything. She thought about whether the two things she'd found in this house, the ease and the warmth and the children who were, daily, making themselves a permanent presence in her chest, could survive being built on a foundation that had not been fully level. She thought about the question mark in Nora's drawing. On the evening of the second day, she was sitting on the porch steps watching the remains of the day's snow turn gray in the yard when Owen came out and sat beside her without speaking. They sat together for a while. He had his chess piece, the White Queen, which he carried in his pocket like a talisman. "Are you going to leave?" he asked finally. She looked at him. His profile in the last of the light was very like his father's, the same jaw, the same considering stillness. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He turned the chess piece over in his fingers. "Okay," he said. "I just wanted to know if I should stop setting up the board for two people." She didn't trust herself to say anything to that. So she didn't say anything. The argument, when it finally came, happened on a Thursday. It had been building for days, not loudly, not in the dramatic, pressurized way of arguments in films, but in the small, incremental way of two people who are genuinely trying to understand each other and keep not quite getting there. She had told him she needed time to process. He had given her time, but he was not, as it turned out, very good at the particular silence of waiting, and she had come into the kitchen that evening to find him standing by the counter with his phone face down and his jaw set and the expression of a man who has been keeping something caged for too long. "Do you want to leave?" he said. "Because if you do, just tell me. I can handle that. What I can't handle is watching you be somewhere else while you're in the same room." She'd said things. He'd said things. Nothing catastrophic, no cruelty, no weapons drawn from places below the belt, but the kind of honest, tired exchange that happens when two people stop being careful with each other, which is either the end of something or the beginning of something, and in the moment it's impossible to tell which. She had taken her coat from the hook and walked out the front door into the dark and the cold and the fresh snow that had started falling an hour earlier. She was halfway down the drive when she heard the door open behind her. She turned. Nora and Owen were standing on the porch in their pajamas, their feet bare, snow catching in their hair. "Don't go," Nora said. Not in the voice of a child performing a scene, in the quiet, direct voice of a child who has felt this moment before and knows what it means. Owen didn't say anything. He walked down the porch steps and through the snow in his bare feet and stood in front of her and held out his hand, the White Queen in his palm. Hannah looked at the chess piece. She looked at Owen's face, the same careful, measuring expression, now with something underneath it that she recognized, finally, for what it was. Not hope, something older than hope, something closer to the willingness to hope, despite the cost of it. She took the queen. "You two are going to get frostbite," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she'd intended. "It's fine," said Nora. "We're not cold. You're standing in the snow in your pajamas in December." "We know," said Owen. "We didn't want you to leave before we said." He stopped, looked at his sister. "We like you," Nora finished. "We just wanted you to know that. Not because of Dad. Just we like you. You explain things in a way that makes sense. You don't talk to us like we're babies, and you put extra butter on the pancakes." Hannah made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. She walked back up the path, past them, up the porch steps. She opened the door and held it open. "Inside," she said. "Now. Both of you. Warm water on your feet before bed." They scrambled in past her, relieved and pleased with themselves in the way of children who have pulled off something risky. She stood in the doorway for a moment, in the cold, looking at the yard. The snow was still falling. She closed the door. The night, they finally said what needed to be said, was a quiet one. No drama, no borrowed scenery, no stakes arranged for effect. The twins were asleep. The house was what it usually was after 8 o'clock. The particular piece of a household that has successfully completed another day. Dishes done, tomorrow's lunches packed in the refrigerator, the low, warm light of the kitchen and the sound of the heat moving through the old radiators. Elliot was making tea. Hannah was at the kitchen table with a stack of essays from her class, a red pen in her hand, correcting a student's confident but entirely incorrect assertion about the water cycle. She was not looking for an opening. She was not rehearsing. She had, in the past several weeks, learned that rehearsing things with this particular man was largely useless because he tended to say something direct and honest before she got there. This time was no different. "I want to be clear about something," Elliot said. He was still standing by the counter, both hands around his mug. "Okay," she said. "The night I walked over to your table, I said I needed someone for my children. That was true, but it was also the version I told myself because the other version was harder to say to a stranger." Hannah put down the red pen. "What was the other version?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I saw someone sitting very still in the middle of something awful, and I thought whoever she is, she has a kind of grace that I haven't seen in a long time, and I didn't want her to just leave. I didn't want to watch that walk out the door and go back to the evening I was having without doing something about it." Hannah looked at him. He looked back. "I'm not trying to confuse the arrangement," he said. "I'm not trying to complicate what we agreed. I'm telling you the truth, because I should have started there. Because you deserve the whole picture." "And what is the whole picture?" she asked quietly. He set down his mug. "The first night, I needed someone good for my children. That was real. It's still real. But somewhere between the cinnamon rolls and the chess and the morning coffee, and watching you explain photosynthesis to Nora with the same patience you give my 8-year-old students, I stopped being practical about it." A pause. "I love you," he said. "That's the whole picture." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow had started again. She could hear it faintly against the window, the soft percussion of a world resettling. "I know," she said finally. "I know. Because I've been watching you try not to say it for 3 weeks and trying not to feel it for 2.5, and I'm tired of both." He crossed the kitchen. He didn't rush it. She stood up. The first time he touched her really touched her. Both hands at her face, his forehead against hers was the simplest thing in the world and the most significant. And she thought, "Here, this is the one. This is the one worth all of it." They married in the middle of February, 3 months after a blind date that had failed in the most thorough and useful way a blind date can possibly fail. The wedding was not large. Diane was there, wearing a violet dress and crying from the processional onward. Petra was there, characteristically dry-eyed, standing at Hannah's shoulder with a small skeptical expression that softened incrementally over the course of the afternoon. Elliot's sister, Margot, who had been doing Tuesdays and Thursdays for 2 years and who had, on first meeting Hannah, said only about time and hugged her, was there, seated in the front row with the vindicated expression of someone whose instincts have been proved correct. Nora and Owen were the flower girl and ring bearer, a division of labor they had negotiated with the seriousness of small diplomats. Owen carried the rings in a small wooden box he had sanded and finished himself, or mostly himself, with significant assistance from his father. Nora walked ahead of her brother with the focused intensity of someone who has rehearsed this 11 times and is determined not to drop a single petal in the wrong location. The venue was a converted farmhouse outside the city, white-walled, high-ceilinged, with windows that looked out over a field where snow had been lying undisturbed for days. Someone had strung warm lights along the rafters. The flowers were simple white and winter green, nothing elaborate. Hannah wore a dress her mother had helped her choose. Ivory, clean-lined, with long sleeves against the cold, and a hemline that swept the floor. She'd kept the pearl earrings her father had given her, because it had seemed important that some piece of him be there too. When she walked down the aisle on her mother's arm, Diane's hand tight on hers, she looked at Elliot and found him watching her with an expression she had come to know well in 3 months. The particular stillness that meant he was paying full attention, that he was here, entirely here. He had written his own vows, and he read them without notes, which she'd known he would. "I went looking for someone kind," he said. "I found someone who made my children explain photosynthesis correctly, challenged me to be honest, and put extra butter on the pancakes. I found, against all odds and in the most unexpected place, the person I was actually looking for, and I plan to spend a long time being grateful for the blind date that went wrong." Hannah's vows were shorter, she had learned. In the classroom, the value of brevity, but she meant every word. "I came to dinner not looking for anything. I left with 2 chess lessons, a cinnamon roll, and a life I didn't know I was missing. I'm not a person who adjusts easily, but this family," she looked at the twins, who were watching her from the front row with the solemn joy of small people at an important occasion, "adjusted me, in the best possible way." After the ceremony, when the 4 of them stood together outside in the winter afternoon, the snow beginning again. Soft and unhurried, a photographer called to them to look toward the camera. Nora grabbed Hannah's hand. Owen grabbed Elliot's. They stood in a row in the falling snow, a family, assembled in the most unlikely way, in the most unlikely order, and Nora looked up at Hannah and said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has decided something and does not expect it to be contradicted, "Mom." Just that one word. Hannah's throat tightened. She looked down at the girl, at the small, serious face looking up at her in the snow, at the white petals still caught in her hair from the processional, and thought about a blank space in a drawing, a question mark where a person should be, thought about how long that space had been waiting. She squeezed Nora's hand. "Yeah," she said softly, "I'm here." The snow fell around them, quiet and indifferent and entirely beautiful. Elliot's hand found hers warm, steady, the hand of a man who builds things and takes care of things and, she had discovered, loves with the same patient, committed thoroughness with which he does everything else. She thought about the cold restaurant, the empty breadbasket, the sound of Preston Beaumont's chair scraping back. She thought about how certain kinds of endings are not endings at all. She thought about all the things that have to go wrong, in exactly the right order, to make room for the thing that goes right. The photographer called out. Owen waved at the camera. Nora stood very straight. Elliot laughed the real laugh, the one that reached his eyes. Hannah smiled. The worst date of her life had become the best evening of her life. And that was, she thought, a story worth telling.